There is a corner of Europe where the past seems to have refused to disappear. A place where green mountains fall almost directly into the Atlantic, where villages are separated by valleys that once isolated families for generations, where people still speak a language that does not belong to the great linguistic family that conquered almost all of Europe, and where for decades scientists studying blood discovered something unusual. Certain blood group variants appeared at frequencies that seemed strangely different from those of surrounding populations. The people who live here are the Basques. And for more than a century, their unusual language, their apparent genetic isolation, and their location on the Atlantic coast have inspired an extraordinary possibility. What if the Basques are not simply one of Europe's oldest surviving cultures? What if they are the descendants of survivors from a civilization that disappeared before recorded history, a civilization Plato called Atlantis? It is an irresistible idea, but there is a problem. If Atlantis was only a philosophical story, genetics should expose the illusion. If the Basques descended from some unknown population outside the normal history of Europe, genetics should reveal that too. And today, for the first time in human history, we can compare the blood of living Basques with DNA extracted from people who lived in Iberia thousands of years ago. The dead can finally testify. And what they tell us is not the story many people expected, because the deeper we follow the Basque bloodline, the less it looks like evidence for Atlantis. And yet, somehow, the mystery becomes even greater. To understand why, we have to begin not beneath the Atlantic Ocean, but on the traditional Basque homeland stretches across the western Pyrenees, divided today between northern Spain and southwestern France. To the north lies the Bay of Biscay. To the south, valleys descend toward the Ebro. Mountains, forests, rivers, and an often violent sea have shaped communities here for thousands of years. The geography matters. For most of European history, mountains were not scenery, they were walls. A journey that takes an hour by car today might once have required crossing dangerous passes, flooded rivers, or dense forests. A neighboring valley could remain culturally distinct even when it lay only a short distance away, say. And in this landscape survived something almost unique. Euskara, the Basque language. Spanish, French, English, German, Russian, Greek, Hindi, and dozens of other languages belong, however distantly, to the Indo-European family. Euskara. No relationship between Basque and any other surviving language family has been conclusively demonstrated. Linguists classify it as an isolate. Ancient inscriptions from Aquitaine preserve names and linguistic forms closely related to Basque, suggesting that languages ancestral or closely related to modern Euskara were spoken in the wider Pyrenean region during antiquity. Imagine what that means. Empires arrived. Languages vanished. Rome conquered Iberia. Latin spread through towns, armies, administration, and trade. Over centuries, Latin evolved into Spanish, French, Portuguese, Catalan, and other Romance languages. Elsewhere in Europe, Celtic languages retreated, Germanic languages expanded, Slavic languages spread. Political borders shifted repeatedly, but in part of the Western Pyrenees, a language from before that Indo-European linguistic Basque survived. Not unchanged, no living language remains frozen for thousands of years, but alive. That alone would have guaranteed the Basques a special place in European history. Then came the blood. During the 20th century, researchers examining the ABO and rhesus blood group systems noticed unusual frequencies among Basque populations. One characteristic became especially famous: Rhd-negative blood. Popular accounts transformed this into something almost supernatural. The Basques, it was sometimes said, possessed blood unlike anyone else on Earth. That is an exaggeration. But it grew from a real observation. Studies have repeatedly found unusually high frequencies of the genetic variant associated with Rhd negativity in Basque populations. A detailed genomic study published in 2018 found the Rhd deletion at a frequency of 47.2% in its Basque sample, among the highest levels observed in the populations examined. And once that number entered popular culture, imagination did the rest. Maybe the Basques were the remnants of Europe's first inhabitants. Maybe their ancestors came from North Africa, maybe from the Caucasus, maybe from an unknown Ice Age civilization. And inevitably someone looked west, toward the Atlantic. The idea had everything a mystery needed. A people who appeared genetically unusual, a language with no living relatives, an ancient population living beside the ocean. And somewhere beyond that ocean, according to one of history's most famous stories, an entire civilization had vanished beneath the waves. But before we connect those two mysteries, we need to ask a more uncomfortable question. What exactly do we know about Atlantis? Almost everything the modern world associates with Atlantis ultimately leads back to one man, Plato. Writing in the 4th century BCE, Plato introduced Atlantis in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. The story is presented through layers of transmission. Critias says he heard it through his family. The Athenian statesman Solon had supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais. Those priests, according to the story, possessed records describing events far older than the historical memory of Greece. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar, there had once existed a great island power, Atlantis, rich, militarily powerful, filled with monumental construction. Its rulers controlled territories beyond the island itself. Then Atlantis attempted to dominate the peoples around the Mediterranean. Ancient Athens resisted. Atlantis was defeated, and afterward came catastrophe, earthquakes, floods, and in Plato's telling, Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. The chronology is one of the strangest elements of the entire story. Plato places these events approximately 9,000 years before the age of Solon. Taken literally, that pushes Atlantis back to roughly the 10th millennium BCE. Near the end of the last ice age, long before Egypt built its pyramids, long before Stonehenge, long before the first known cities of Mesopotamia. That date has fascinated Atlantis researchers ever since, because around that general period, the planet really was undergoing dramatic environmental change. Ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were rising, coastlines were moving, land that humans had once occupied disappeared underwater. Along the Atlantic coast of Europe, geological reconstructions show that relative sea level rose especially rapidly during the early Holocene, particularly between roughly 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. So here is our first genuine mystery. Plato described the destruction of a civilization by water at approximately the same broad prehistoric transition, during which rising seas were transforming enormous stretches of the world's coastline. Coincidence? A preserved cultural memory? Or simply a date selected for dramatic antiquity? We do not know, and that distinction is critical. There is no independent Egyptian document known to historians that confirms Plato's Atlantis story. There is no surviving Atlantean inscription, no royal list, no coin, no shipwreck that can be identified as Atlantean. No archaeological layer has been universally accepted as the civilization Plato described. Indeed, scholarly treatments emphasize that the literary Atlantis tradition originates with Plato, and the story serves an obvious philosophical purpose inside his dialogues. Atlantis becomes the powerful, morally declining empire against which an idealized ancient Athens demonstrates political virtue. That does not mathematically prove Plato invented every detail. Authors can transform memories of real disasters into fiction. Stories can combine several historical events. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and destroyed coastal settlements were part of Mediterranean experience. But there is a vast difference between saying Plato may have drawn inspiration from real events and saying a technologically advanced Atlantic empire existed exactly as he described it. And that distinction becomes even more important when we return to the Basques. Because sometime during the modern fascination with human origins, the Basques were pulled into the Atlantis story. The reasoning seemed almost perfect. If Atlantis lay beyond Gibraltar, survivors escaping its destruction might have reached the Atlantic coast of Iberia. If those survivors found refuge among the Western Pyrenees, geography could have protected them. Their descendants might preserve an unusual language. Isolation could preserve unusual genetic traits. And suddenly the Basque mystery appeared to become an archaeological fingerprint of Atlantis. Some later writers even circulated stories of a Basque ancestral island called Atlantica, supposedly a green land swallowed by the sea. It sounds devastatingly important. There is only one problem. When we search for a securely documented ancient Basque tradition matching that claim, the trail becomes remarkably weak. The concept appears prominently in modern Atlantis literature, but establishing it as an independently preserved ancient Basque oral tradition is far more difficult. Even a paper associated with a Basque Studies Congress that considered the Atlantis hypothesis ultimately described the Atlantean origin of the Basques as highly doubtful. That does not mean Basque folklore lacks ancient myths. Quite the opposite. Basque mythology contains a rich world of supernatural beings, sacred landscapes and traditions shaped by centuries of cultural transmission. But folklore is not automatically a historical recording device. Stories change, names change. Foreign stories enter local traditions. Modern writers reinterpret ancient motifs, and once a famous legend like Atlantis becomes globally known, it becomes extremely difficult to determine whether a similar local story predates that influence or absorbed it. This gives us our first reversal. One of the most dramatic supposed links between the Basques and Atlantis may not be ancient evidence at all. It may be a modern story about an ancient story. But the blood remains. And blood is harder to rewrite. For decades, the unusual distribution of blood groups among Basques encouraged the idea that they represented an extraordinarily ancient population isolated from the rest of Europe. The RHD story became especially powerful because of its biological consequences. The Rh blood group system includes proteins found on red blood cells. An Rhd-negative person lacks the Rhd antigen. Under certain circumstances, incompatibility between an Rhd-negative mother and an Rhd-positive fetus can lead to maternal antibody formation and complications in later pregnancies. Today, that medical problem can often be prevented. But historically, before modern treatment, the evolutionary persistence of Rhd negativity at relatively high frequencies created an intriguing question. Why would such a genetic variant remain common? Was there some unknown survival advantage? Was it a marker inherited from an ancient population? Could it be evidence of a lineage separated from other Europeans for immense periods of time? Those questions are legitimate. The extraordinary answers usually are not. When researchers examined the Rh system at greater genetic resolution, they found something that rarely appears in sensational accounts. The Basque Rh system does not look like it came from some mysterious biological population outside humanity's known genetic history. The 2018 research found that despite the high frequency of the Rhd deletion, Basque Ach haplotypes and sequence diversity were broadly close to those of other European populations. The researchers argued that demographic processes such as isolation, population size, and genetic drift were likely important in producing the observed frequencies. They also noted that high Rhd negative frequencies form something of a regional gradient rather than a supernatural genetic wall surrounding the Basque country. That word, drift, sounds almost disappointingly ordinary, but genetic drift can produce extraordinary results. Imagine a small population. Not 10 million people moving freely across a continent, but villages separated by mountains. Families marrying mostly within nearby communities. Some genetic variants happen to be common among the founders of those populations, others happen to be rare. Generation after generation, chance alone changes those proportions. If outside migration remains limited, the genetic signature becomes increasingly recognizable. No lost civilization is required, only time, geography, marriage, birth, death, and chance. But that explanation still left one question unanswered. How long had the Basques been isolated? For years, the most dramatic theory suggested something astonishing. Perhaps the Basques were direct remnants of Paleolithic Europeans, the descendants of the hunter-gatherers who survived the Ice Age in the Franco-Cantabrian region. If so, their ancestry might stretch back relatively unchanged for more than 10,000 years. That possibility seemed to fit everything. Their language, their blood, their mountains, their location near caves containing some of Europe's great Paleolithic art. And perhaps even the possibility that their ancestors had witnessed the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. For a time, some genetic research appeared compatible with at least partial deep continuity. Studies of mitochondrial DNA identified Basque-associated maternal lineages and proposed prehistoric continuity in the Franco-Cantabrian region. The mystery seemed to be moving backward toward Atlantis. Then scientists began extracting entire genomes from ancient human bones. And the story changed. Ancient DNA is one of the closest things archaeology has to a time machine. A pottery style can spread without a population moving, a religion can cross borders, a language can replace another, a sword can be traded, but DNA is carried by people. If you can recover enough ancient genomes from enough time periods, you can begin watching populations move through history, not metaphorically, genetically. In 2015, researchers analyzed genome-wide DNA from prehistoric individuals discovered at El Portalón in the Atapuerca region of northern Spain. These people lived thousands of years ago, during the period when farming populations had spread across Europe and mixed with local hunter-gatherers. Their genomes showed a strong affinity with modern Basques. That finding weakened the simplest version of the Paleolithic survivor theory. The Basques were not merely an untouched population descended directly from Ice Age hunter-gatherers. They carried ancestry connected to the farmers who had entered Europe during the Neolithic and mixed with earlier populations. Already, the bloodline was becoming more complicated. Then came another revelation. In 2019, a major study reconstructed the genomic history of the Iberian Peninsula using hundreds of ancient individuals. And buried inside that research was a result that fundamentally changed the Basque mystery. Around the Bronze Age, people carrying ancestry associated with the Eurasian steppe entered Iberia. The demographic impact was enormous. By rough 2000 BCE, the researchers estimated that about 40% of Iberian ancestry had been replaced, and nearly all local Y chromosome lineages had been replaced by lineages associated with populations carrying steppe ancestry. And the Basque ancestors were not untouched by this transformation. Steppe ancestry was already present in non-Indo-European speaking regions. In other words, whatever protected Euskara or its ancestors from Indo-European linguistic replacement did not prevent genetic mixing. The language survived an event that the genes did not avoid. This is one of the most important clues in the entire investigation. Language and DNA do not move according to identical rules. A population can adopt a new language without being genetically replaced. A population can absorb newcomers while preserving its language. Conquerors can impose language without leaving an overwhelming genetic signature. Or immigrants can contribute enormous genetic ancestry while eventually adopting the local tongue. The human past is not a family tree, it is a web. And this means Euskara cannot be used as proof that Basque DNA has remained untouched since the Ice Age. But the 2019 study revealed something else, something arguably more remarkable. When researchers compared present-day Basques with ancient people from Iberia, the Basques looked very much like an Iron Age Iberian population that had experienced less of the later gene flow, affecting other parts of the peninsula. Beginning in the Roman period, migration introduced additional ancestry related to the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa into many Iberian populations. The Basques experienced less of this later admixture. Their genetic distinctiveness was not best explained by descent from some unknown external civilization. It was explained largely by continuity, not continuity from Atlantis, continuity from Iron Age Iberia. Think about that carefully. For generations, people looked at Basque genetic distinctiveness and asked, where did these strange genes come from? Modern ancient DNA research suggests that may be the wrong question. Perhaps the more revealing question is, what happened to everyone else? The Basques may appear unusual partly because surrounding populations continued changing. Rome connected Iberia with a vast Mediterranean world. Merchants arrived, soldiers arrived, administrators arrived, slaves arrived. Later came Germanic kingdoms, then centuries of Islamic rule transformed much of Iberia. Populations moved, frontiers changed, people migrated north and south. But some Basque-speaking communities remained comparatively less affected by several of these later movements. Their distinctiveness may therefore reflect not mysterious arrival, but reduced departure from an older genetic landscape. They were not necessarily outsiders entering Europe. They were insiders who experienced less of what came afterward. A 2021 genome-wide study sharpened this conclusion even further. Researchers examining Basque and neighboring populations found clear Basque genetic differentiation, but concluded that it could not be explained by an external origin. Instead, the pattern was consistent with genetic continuity since the Iron Age combined with subsequent isolation and reduced gene flow, possibly reinforced by geography and the language barrier. And suddenly, one of the great mysteries of Europe had changed shape. The Basques were indeed genetically distinctive. but not because their ancestors emerged from some unknown branch of humanity, not because Rh-negative blood proved descent from Atlantis, and not because they survived unchanged from the Paleolithic. Their DNA belongs firmly within the history of Western European populations. The unusual part is the pattern of preservation. Imagine a medieval manuscript. Every neighboring copy has been edited repeatedly, pages replaced, sentences added, paragraphs borrowed from foreign manuscripts. But one copy, protected in a mountain monastery, received fewer alterations. When modern scholars compare them, that manuscript looks strange. Not because it was written on another planet, because it preserved more of an earlier version. Something similar appears to have happened genetically in the Basque region, and that may be more historically extraordinary than any Atlantis theory. But then archaeology uncovered another clue. In 2021, during excavations at the Iron Age settlement of Irulegi in Navarre, archaeologists revealed a small bronze object shaped like a human hand. It had been discovered near the entrance of a building destroyed during the turbulent 1st century BCE. Across its surface were inscribed lines of text. The object became known as the Hand of Irulegi. For a region where surviving pre-Roman inscriptions in Vasconic territory are extremely rare, the discovery was extraordinary. Researchers studying the inscription argued that the writing represents a Vasconic linguistic system related to the roots of modern Basque. The object was likely displayed at the entrance of a domestic building, perhaps carrying a ritual message associated with good fortune or protection. For anyone seeking Atlantis, this should sound exciting. A mysterious language, an ancient bronze hand, a ritual inscription. A people whose language survived when others vanished. But once again, the evidence moves in the opposite direction. The Hand of Irulegi does not point west across the ocean. It roots Basque linguistic ancestry more firmly in the ancient Western Pyrenean world. And that matters, because every genuine discovery we make seems to reduce the need for Atlantis. The blood can be explained through known European population history. The language has connections to ancient Aquitanian and Vasconic material from the same broader region. The archaeology shows local continuity. The genetics show no mysterious external source. So is the case closed? Not quite. Because we still have one enormous coincidence. The ocean. Return to Plato's date. Roughly the end of the Ice Age. At that time, the world really was losing land. At the last glacial maximum, global sea level had been around 120 to 130 meters lower than it is today. As the climate warmed and continental ice melted, enormous areas of coastal territory were submerged. Places where human beings had hunted, camped, traveled, and perhaps lived for generations disappeared. If you could stand on the Atlantic coast of Europe 20,000 years ago, the coastline would not be where it is today. The landscape your descendants inherited would be fundamentally different. Rivers would reach the ocean farther away. Continental shelves now underwater could have been dry land. Generation after generation, the sea advanced. Sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly enough to transform environments within human memory. Entire ecological worlds vanished. This is not mythology. It happened. So when cultures around the world preserve stories of catastrophic floods, researchers face a difficult question. Are these stories memories of real environmental events? Some almost certainly are. A tsunami can become a legend. A volcanic eruption become a story about angry gods. A local flood can become a tale about the destruction of an entire world. But proving that a particular myth preserves a particular geological event across thousands of years is extraordinarily difficult. Humans are excellent storytellers. We are also excellent at rewriting stories without realizing we are doing it. Suppose a coastal community around 9,000 years ago witnessed a disastrous flood. A survivor told a child. The child told grandchildren. The story lasted 200 years. Then 500. Then 1,000. Names changed, the coastline changed, new religions arrived, new enemies appeared, new moral lessons were added. After 4,000 years, would the story still describe the same place? After 8,000, would a drowned village become a drowned kingdom? Would a king become a god? Would a storm become divine punishment? Would several different disasters merge into one? Possibly. But possibility is not evidence. And this is where Atlantis becomes almost impossible to kill, because it occupies the space between what geology says could happen and what archaeology can prove did happen. A continent-sized advanced civilization cannot simply disappear into the Atlantic without leaving geological consequences. Modern plate tectonics shows that continental crust and oceanic crust behave very differently, and mapping of the Atlantic seafloor reveals an ocean basin created through seafloor spreading over tens of millions of years. There is no geological mechanism capable of swallowing a vast continent in the central Atlantic within a day and a night during human prehistory while leaving the surrounding plate structure as we see it today. That version of Atlantis is extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with geology. But drowned coastal settlements, those absolutely exist. Submerged prehistoric landscapes? Certainly. Islands damaged by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or tsunamis, repeatedly. And suddenly Atlantis divides into two different questions. Did Plato's enormous Atlantic empire exist exactly as described? There is no compelling archaeological or geological evidence that it did. Could memories of real prehistoric disasters have contributed, directly or indirectly, to stories like Atlantis? That is harder to rule out. And now the Basque country becomes interesting again. Not as a refuge for Atlantean princes escaping a sinking super-civilization, but as part of a region occupied through enormous environmental transformations. The Franco-Cantabrian zone was important during the Upper Paleolithic. Caves across northern Iberia and southwestern France preserve astonishing traces of prehistoric human life. Animals painted in darkness, tools, bones, hearths, burials, evidence that people survived severe climatic periods near this Western European refuge. Recent ancient DNA work from sites such as El Morón continues to reveal how complex population continuity and replacement were in Iberia across the end of the Pleistocene. Those people watched glaciers retreat. They watched forests move north. They watched animal populations change. And along the coast, their descendants watched the Atlantic claim land. There was no need for Atlantis for human beings to experience a lost world. They lived through one. This may be the most important idea in our investigation. We tend to imagine Atlantis as a city. Perhaps that is why we keep looking for walls, for temples, for concentric canals, for golden palaces on the seafloor. But prehistoric people could lose an entire world without losing a city. A hunting ground could disappear. An ancestral shoreline could vanish. A sacred island could be cut off. A valley could flood. A place where generations were buried could slip beneath the water. To those people, that would be a lost civilization in the deepest emotional sense. Not because it contained skyscrapers, because it contained memory. Could echoes of such experiences have survived in Atlantic European mythology? Perhaps, but we have no secure chain connecting such memories specifically to Plato's Atlantis, and we have no secure evidence connecting them specifically to the origin of the Basques. The distinction matters because mysteries become dangerous when possibility is presented as proof. Yet there is another part of the Basque story that makes the Atlantis comparison psychologically powerful. Survival. The Basque language survived Rome. It survived medieval political transformation. It survived centuries in which dominant neighboring languages expanded. In the 20th century, during Francisco Franco's dictatorship in Spain, the public use of Basque was severely restricted in many contexts. Families, teachers, writers, and communities nevertheless kept the language alive. Today, Euskara is spoken, taught, printed, broadcast, and studied. That survival changes how people experience history. For many cultures, antiquity exists primarily in ruins. For the Basques, part of antiquity can still be heard. A child speaking Euskara today is not speaking exactly as an Iron Age person spoke. Languages evolve constantly. But the linguistic tradition connects the present to a pre-Roman world in a way few Western European populations can experience. And when a culture has survived so many historical pressures, stories describing it as the remnant of an older lost world become emotionally powerful. They feel true even when they are not literally true. This is how myths become stronger than evidence. Not because people are foolish, because myths answer questions that data often cannot. Science can tell us that a population contains certain proportions of ancestry. It can model genetic drift. It can estimate admixture. It can sequence an ancient tooth. But science cannot tell a community what survival means. A laboratory can explain why a blood group allele became common. It cannot measure what it feels like to speak a language surrounded by languages unrelated to it. And that difference may explain why the Atlantis hypothesis refuses to disappear. There is also something seductive about isolation. We see an unusual population and assume there must have been an unusual origin. But evolution often produces the opposite. Isolation does not necessarily mean something came from somewhere exotic. Sometimes isolation means something stayed where it was. This is exactly what modern Basque genetics increasingly suggests. In a 2019 analysis of fine-scale genetic structure across Spain, researchers detected distinct structure in the Basque region, alongside strong evidence that historical migrations and regional isolation shaped genetic differences throughout Iberia. Again, the Basques were different, but difference itself was not evidence of foreign origin. That is an important lesson far beyond this story. Human populations are not separate biological boxes. There is no magical line at which one people stops and another begins. Genes move across cultural boundaries. Cultures move without genes. Languages cross populations. Religions cross languages. Political identities form long after genetic differences emerge. The Basque story is not about a biologically separate people. It is about the extraordinary interaction between ancestry, geography, language, and history. And once we understand that, the famous question, "Where did the Basques come from?" begins to seem strangely misleading because everyone comes from many places. Basque ancestry, like the ancestry of other Europeans, contains layers: hunter-gatherers, early farmers, later Bronze Age migrations, Iron Age communities, and thousands of years of local continuity and limited but never non-existent contact with neighbors. There was no single morning when the Basques suddenly appeared. Identity emerged gradually, language persisted, communities formed, borders shifted, history accumulated. The mystery is not that Basques have no ancestors. The mystery is that one cultural and linguistic thread survived while so many comparable threads across prehistoric Europe disappeared. And perhaps the strongest clue lies not in blood, but in geography. Look again at the Western Pyrenees. Mountains create fragmentation, valleys channel movement. The sea creates another frontier. Historical communities develop dense local networks. Language can become a social boundary. The 2021 genomic study found significant internal Basque genetic structure correlated with geography, and researchers suggested that the linguistic barrier itself may have helped reinforce reduced gene flow over time. Language protects genes. Genes record geography. Geography protects language, not perfectly, but enough. That feedback loop could preserve cultural distinctiveness for astonishing periods without requiring a vanished continent. And yet, there is still Plato. Still that date. Still the ocean. Still the question that has haunted explorers, philosophers, and treasure hunters for centuries. What if there was something? Not the Atlantis of crystal towers and impossible technology, not an empire spanning the Atlantic, but a real disaster, a real island, a real coastal society. A story transformed beyond recognition over thousands of years. Could Plato have inherited a distorted memory of such an event? Scholars have proposed many candidates: the volcanic destruction associated with Thera in the Aegean, memories of Bronze Age political collapse, flood catastrophes, ancient wars, real geography mixed with philosophical invention. There is no consensus identifying any one of these as Atlantis. And perhaps searching for a single location misunderstands how stories are created. Plato may have combined geography, history, mythology, and political philosophy into something deliberately larger than any one source. Atlantis could be partly remembered and partly invented, or almost entirely invented. We cannot interrogate Plato. We cannot inspect the Egyptian records he claimed lay behind the story because no such records have been identified. We are left with a text, an unfinished text. Critias ends before completing the Atlantis narrative. For one of history's most famous lost civilizations, even the original story itself is lost. There is something almost perfect about that. But we can interrogate the Basques, not their legends, their chromosomes, and those chromosomes have delivered a verdict. So far, there is no genetic evidence that the Basques descend from a mysterious external civilization unknown to European prehistory. Their genomes place them within the known population history of Iberia and Western Europe. Modern genomic research specifically argues against explaining Basque genetic differentiation through an external origin. The Rh-negative mystery does not change that. Its unusually high frequency is real. Its supernatural interpretation is not supported. The Basque language remains extraordinary, but a language isolate is not evidence of Atlantis. The Hand of Irulegi is extraordinary, but it points toward ancient Vasconic culture in Iberia, not toward a sunken Atlantic empire. The Ice Age flooding was real, but real sea level rise does not prove Plato was recording it. One by one, the strongest supposed clues break apart when examined closely, and normally this is where an investigation ends. Case closed, myth defeated by science. But that conclusion would miss what the evidence has actually revealed. Because the real Basque story may be more remarkable than the Atlantis story. Atlantis asks us to believe that an advanced civilization disappeared completely. The Basques show us something almost opposite. They show us how difficult it is for something ancient to survive. Imagine Europe 3,000 years ago, a continent filled with languages we will never hear, names that were never written down, gods whose stories vanished, songs no historian recorded, families whose identities disappeared into later populations. Entire cultural worlds existed, transformed and vanished without leaving enough evidence for us even to name them. Euskara survived. Against those odds, one linguistic lineage remained audible, and DNA suggests that communities speaking its ancestors persisted through enormous demographic upheavals while maintaining unusually strong continuity from Iron Age Iberia into the present. That is not immortality, there was migration. There was mixture, there was change, but there was also survival. Perhaps that is why Atlantis feels so close whenever we talk about the Basques. Not because the Basques necessarily came from a lost civilization, but because they remind us how many civilizations have been lost. Euskara is surrounded by ghosts, not supernatural ghosts, linguistic ones. Languages that once existed across Western Europe before Celtic, Latin and other Indo-European tongues became dominant. We cannot hear them. We know some only from names scratched onto stone. Others vanished without leaving a single sentence. Basques survived among them. Maybe the great mistake in the Atlantis theory is assuming that something unusual must come from somewhere else. Perhaps the ancient mystery was here all along. In the valleys, in the mountains, in communities stubborn enough or fortunate enough to preserve what history erased elsewhere. And there is one final irony. People searching for Atlantis often imagine DNA will reveal a hidden race, a biological secret. Some genetic signature proving that a chosen population descends from a forgotten civilization. But ancient DNA has taught us almost the opposite lesson. Human history is mixture. Again and again, populations once imagined as pure or isolated turn out to contain layers of migration. The Basques are no exception. They carry ancestry from prehistoric hunter-gatherers, from early farming populations, from later groups associated with the steppe migrations that reshaped Europe. They are not fossils, they are people, and perhaps that is what makes their survival meaningful. A fossil survives because it is dead. A culture survives by changing without completely becoming something else. That is much harder. The Atlantis hypothesis asks whether the Basques are descendants of survivors. Science gives us an unexpected answer, yes, but probably not in the way the legend suggests. They are survivors of the same catastrophes that created modern Europe. Climate change, migration, conquest, population replacement, empire, religious transformation, political repression, modernization. The remarkable thing is not that their ancestors escaped history. It is that history passed through them without erasing everything that came before. And somewhere in that distinction lies the reason we remain obsessed with lost civilizations. Atlantis is not only a place. It is a fear. The fear that everything we build can disappear. Cities, languages, religions, nations. We look beneath the Atlantic because we want proof that a forgotten world once existed, but perhaps we should also look at the things that almost disappeared and somehow remained. A word spoken by a grandmother. A place name older than the kingdom surrounding it. A genetic pattern shaped by centuries of isolation. A bronze hand buried beneath the ruins of an Iron Age home. Each is a fragment. None proves Atlantis. Together, they tell another story. A story about memory surviving catastrophe. So were the Basques the last descendants of Atlantis? Based on the genetic, linguistic, archaeological, and geological evidence available today, there is no convincing reason to believe so. Their genetic distinctiveness can be explained within the known history of Western Europe. Their language appears deeply rooted in the Pyrenean region. Their unusual blood group frequencies can arise through ordinary evolutionary processes such as drift and isolation, and geology provides no evidence for the disappearance of a continent-sized Atlantic landmass during human prehistory. But science has not destroyed the mystery. It has replaced one mystery with another. Why did Euskara survive when neighboring prehistoric languages vanished? Exactly how far back can its ancestors be traced? What stories disappeared along the Atlantic coastline as the Ice Age ended? How much of humanity's earliest history now lies beneath shallow seas where archaeology has barely begun? And how many peoples we consider mysterious today are not descendants of some vanished world, but the last surviving windows into a world that once surrounded them? Maybe Atlantis will never be found. Maybe Plato created it. Maybe fragments of real disasters lie hidden inside his story. But the Basque country gives us something Atlantis cannot. A lost world that never completely vanished. You can still travel to the Western Pyrenees. You can still hear Euskara spoken. You can still hold ancient DNA against modern DNA and watch thousands of years of human history emerge from the comparison. And perhaps the greatest historical mystery is not how civilizations disappear. We already know they do. The greater mystery is how anything survives. So what do you believe? Is Atlantis purely one of Plato's greatest philosophical inventions? Could his story preserve a distant memory of real prehistoric flooding? And if the Basques are not descendants of Atlantis, what allowed this extraordinary linguistic tradition to survive, while so much of prehistoric Europe fell silent? Tell us what you think. And if you want to continue investigating the mysteries hidden between history, religion, culture, archaeology, and the stories humanity has carried for thousands of years, subscribe to The Last Belief. Because sometimes the legends are wrong, sometimes the evidence is stranger than the legend, and sometimes buried beneath what we believe, there is a question far more important than the answer.